Thank you for tuning in to the 2021 Mineral Symposium of the Pacific Northwest chapter of Friends of Mineralogy. This is our second virtual symposium due to the current health restrictions imposed by the ongoing global pandemic, so we're glad that you're able to join us here today. Our 2021 theme is Minerals of Africa, and our next speaker is Wim Vertriest. Wim Vertriest graduated from the Catholic University in Leuven in Belgium. He obtained a master's degree in geology in 2014, specializing in geodynamics and geofluids, and also gained his FGA and GG diplomas. Since joining the Gemological Institute of America, or GIA, in 2015, Wim has participated in GIA Field Expeditions to numerous gem mining areas around the world, focusing on rubies, sapphires, and emeralds. He has co-authored articles on new gemstone localities, updates on existing mining localities, in-depth gemological studies, and treatment experiments. In his role as manager, Wim is overseeing the field gemology department and oversees the GIA's colored stone research collection in Bangkok. And now Wim Vertriest with his presentation, The Evolution of Ruby Sources in East Africa.
Thanks for the introduction, Julian. Really happy to be here, and I'm very honored that you asked me to give a presentation here. I know this is the mineralogical group, while my background is more in gemology and gemstones. So it's a little bit of a different approach that we're going to be taking. Today I'll be talking about the evolution of ruby sources in East Africa, but that will be more from a gemological perspective, not so much mineralogical perspective. So I'll highlight a few differences that I've observed over the last years between the mineral community and the gem community there that are actually going to be very critical in understanding how these sources evolved and developed, or undeveloped even. But I'll highlight that as we go. Now, a little bit about myself. My name's Wim Vertriest, originally from Belgium. I have a degree in geology, focusing on geodynamics and geofluids. But I've been working at GIA, the Gemological Institute of America, for the last 6 years as field gemologist based in Bangkok. But I have some slides about that, so we'll just jump straight into that one. All right, let's get into it. So today, like I mentioned before, today we'll talk a little bit about the evolution of ruby sources in East Africa. But first, like I promised you, a little bit of background about me and the company I work for. So I work for the Gemological Institute of America, and our main mission is to protect the gem and jewelry buying public. And we do that through a couple of things, and mainly through research, education, and the unbiased gem grading and analysis. So we've got our research division, which is part of the lab, our education division, where you can study everything from diamond grading all the way to jewelry manufacturing. And then, of course, we've got the gem grading and analysis with the diamond grading lab and the colored stone lab, where you can submit gems. I think you're all familiar with that kind of service. But first, I want to highlight the reason why these gemological laboratories, gemological institutes are there. Those institutes have always been there to answer questions from the gemological societies, from the gemological trade, from the gemological world. And I think initially that first question was, what is it? What is this stone? Basic identification. Is this a piece of glass? Is this an iolite? Is this a sapphire? To have an independent party back that up, that's one of the first questions that were asked to gemological labs. And a second question that came later on, is this real? I think this really came with the rise of synthetics in the colored stone world. The diamond world is going through that right now. But colored stones really had that in, like, I'm going to say the 80s, where a lot of synthetic ruby, a lot of synthetic emerald was produced and flooding the market, and became really challenging to identify initially. So that, is it real, was another question that was asked to gemological laboratories. But I think the newest question that is asked to labs like GIA is, where is it from? Origin determination. Origin determination becomes increasingly important. And people are asking it for more and more stones. But this is a new topic, very challenging, not a lot of background in it. So a lot of that groundwork still has to be done, quite literally often. So GIA chooses to take a scientific approach for all its research. I mean, that requires, as a first thing, qualified staff. I mean, you need people not only with a gemological background, but also with a more advanced science background. You need people with a background in solid state physics, especially when you work diamonds, earth sciences, all kinds of mineralogy, analytical chemistry for colored stones. You need specialized biologists when working for pearl analysis, because that is moving into like DNA analysis and things like that. And of course, I've summed up all these advanced techniques. You need access to these advanced instruments. While the microscope and the loupe remain the workhorse of the laboratory and most gemological analysis, there are certain problems that cannot be addressed without advanced technology. So you need access to that technology, but you also need to know how to work it. We have machines at GIA that I don't even know how to turn on, let alone how to operate them, let alone how to operate them correctly. So there's dedicated teams required for those analysis as well. But then the most important probably is going to be reliable samples. You can have a staff of 100 PhDs with the most qualified degrees, the most expensive decked out, pimped out lab in the world. If you don't have the right samples to study, all of the work they're going to do is rubbish from the start. So these reliable samples are actually an overlooked foundation stone of most scientific research. So that's why field gemology is there. Now, what makes a collection reliable? Like I can explain you, but I'm going to use this quote for someone who has way more street cred than I have, and that's Sir David Attenborough, who mentioned in a video from the American Museum of Natural History that a research library associated with collections is almost of greater importance than the objects themselves. The objects in our case being the gemstones or the rough samples. Unless you know where it came from exactly and when it came from exactly, you're missing a lot of very, very important information. And that information can not only come from the object, the gemstone itself, but from the circumstances of documentation that should accompany every scientifically collected specimen. What he's basically saying here is, if you have a pile of stones, all you have is a pile of stones. If you want to turn that into a collection, you need to know all the data around it. When was this found? Who did we get this from? Where did we get it? What other things did we get along with it? How much did we pay for it? What was the weather like? What was the environment like? What kind of mining techniques were used? How close were we to the actual mining? Those are all very important things that make your collection more reliable and will turn your drawer full of stones into a reliable collection. And that is something that is taken as a given in a lot of the mineralogical community, with the mineral collectors. But it is not so common to see that in the gem collectors world. So how do you do that, building a reliable collection? That means going where the stones are. Now, going where the stones are can mean this thing. If you want to collect Ethiopian sapphires, the best thing you can do is going to the Ethiopian desert, finding this dry riverbed, talking to those miners and buying the sapphires directly from them, or even jumping in the pit, mining with them and getting the sapphires that way. That way you're 100% sure these are Ethiopian sapphires. But of course, that's not always practical. That's not always feasible. That's not always economical. I mean, the amount of sapphires you can find there and bring out is hugely limited. Especially with the investment that you need to do to go there. So going where the stones are also means this. That means visiting shows like the Tucson show, because for 1 week a year, the highest concentration of highest value gemstones in the world is in the desert in Arizona, although not a single stone that is sold at that show was mined in Tucson, Arizona. But still, going there is important because you see what's available. There's a huge concentration and you can very efficiently talk to a lot of people, collect a lot of material from all around the world. Of course, we all intuitively feel that what you buy there is less reliable than what you mine yourself. And especially in the mineralogical community, there's a lot of trust going on there. But the gem community, a lot of people remain obscure about their sources. So you need to be careful with that. That's why when we build our collection, we collect as much information as we can about those stones. That includes stone information about the locality, GPS coordinates, local names, local nicknames. but also, and maybe most important, are the buying conditions and the relation to the mining process. Did we buy this from someone who bought it from someone who claimed to be a miner from a town far away? Or did we mine it ourselves, or somewhere in between? There's different gradations of reliability there, and that makes our gem collection more reliable. Now, about GIA's colored stone reference collection, you see that there's a very heavy focus on blue sapphire, ruby, and pink sapphire, because that's where most of the questions from the trade are coming from. Remember, we are here to answer questions from the trade. So most of the demand for origin determination is on blue sapphire and ruby, and the challenges are biggest there. You see that emerald, we have less samples because the demand for origin determination is not as great, and the challenges are not that great. You don't need that many different sources. You don't need that many samples to get to be able to discriminate in different between the different sources. You see there's an increasing amount of spinel coming in. Red spinel is becoming more important in the trade, so we're very actively collecting that as well. Thankful for us, a lot of that spinel is associated with ruby sources, so we're able to collect that along the way. Fancy sapphire mainly includes yellows. Those yellows are becoming increasingly important, and they're very challenging, very interesting stones in terms of color studies. How do these colors react to treatment? How stable are these colors? What causes these colors? Those are all still big question marks. And then we've got other samples that includes matrix specimens, other minerals like, for example, garnets, demantoid, alexandrites are part of that as well. Paraiba tourmalines, we've got a small collection of those too. So you see, like in total, there's about 23,000 samples all stored like this in its individual boxes that make it very easy for us to track the stones and collect data on them. Now, when you go to all these places and you only bring back the samples, that would actually be a waste of resources, because when you go there, you can collect so much more. You can really create an archive of information, like document what these places look like. Because until 20 years ago, very few people cared about where their stones came from. But now people want to know, and there's a huge gap. There's not a lot of information around about the sources of these stones. So we're visiting there. We're able to document it from a relatively neutral position, because we're not invested in buying or protecting that source. We just want to see what's going on. So we talk to a lot of people, the local miners, the local people working there, the people working along the miners, the suppliers, the people who are buying in the bush, filming that, photographing that, and highlighting different aspects of the gem trade, going all the way from the miners, the explorers, all the way to even the end clients, because documenting that whole supply chain is very important, very interesting. And we know that over the last decades, certain parts of the supply chain have been documented very well. We know a lot about jewelry history, jewelry manufacturing, even gem cutting. But if you venture into the realm of gem treatment, rough trading, how do stones get from the mine to the international trade centers? That's very much clouded in mist, very shady affairs. But transparency is demanded there. And as GIA, we try to provide some of that information, provide some of that transparency in there. So that is a very important part of what we'll talk about today, like the evolution of how these gem sources evolved. That all comes from that archive of information that we've built by visiting the field, but also a lot of literature study, obviously. Now, one last point I want to highlight before we jump into East African ruby deposits is going to be the dynamics of gemstone deposits. I think there's a big difference here with the mineralogical relevant deposits, with the specimen deposits, because here there's more of, it's a bigger market, but it's also a very different market. So local conditions can have a very large impact on gem mining. I think that is very similar to the mineralogical community, to the specimen mining, for example. Politics and social situations can have a really big impact. I think the best example we can see right now is probably going to be Afghanistan, where an overnight decision really just cut off all supply of gemstones, or at least hindered it, or at least caused people to doubt their supply chains. Natural environment, that can be critical. Seasonal changes, for example, in Madagascar, mining is very seasonal because people work on their farms, and then when it's not farming season, they tend to start mining. But we see that in other environments, in other areas as well. And then, of course, infrastructure. You can find the most magnificent deposit with the most magnificent materials. If you can't get to it, or if you can't get the material out, or if you can't get your buyers to the material, that deposit is never going to develop. So infrastructure, accessibility is extremely important. And that can be linked to man-made situations or just the natural environment. But the market conditions are going to be the ultimate decider whether your gemstone deposit lives or dies. And I think these market conditions are different in the mineralogical community and the gemstone community. I mean, first of all, your gem deposit needs to be able to deliver volume and quality. Now, that quality is relative. We all know that if you go to a deposit, it's not all flawless specimens. It's not all 5-carat clean gems that come out. You need to be able to have sufficient of that material, but you also need to be able to do something with everything that's not the 1%ers. You need to be able to find a market for the material that is not exceptional. And that is where treatment often plays a larger role, because maybe 1% of the gemstones that comes out of the ground is untreated, magnificent, perfect. Usually it's even less than 1%, but you can't live on that 1%. With those 1%ers is not a sustainable environment. So you need to be able to move an additional 5, 10, 20, 50% to the market. Either you create a market for that not perfect material, or you improve it by treatment. So reaction to treatment, if you can improve that material by treatment, whatever treatment that may be, that can really augment the survival chances of that deposit. And then, of course, there's the public reaction. Like if you find what are for you incredible materials, but the public says, we don't care about this, then your deposit is not going to survive. Of course, this can change over time. I think the best example that we've seen in the gemological community are probably going to be gray spinels. For decades, gray spinels were just, I mean, if you drop them, you wouldn't pick them back up because it's not worth the money. But now people are paying hundreds of dollars a carat for gray spinels all of a sudden. So that can change as well. So all of a sudden, there's a lot of mining going on. People are actively focusing on extracting these gray spinels from the gravels in Mogok, in Vietnam, in other places. While until 5 years ago, people would just throw them in the garbage. So all of these factors are ever changing. They're constantly moving. They're very dynamic. And that just leads to survival of the fittest. Who fits best in all these categories? Who adapts best to the current situation? Who fits best in the current preferences of the market? And that is the one that's going to be the dominant deposit. And I think that is very different from mineralogical deposits where history plays a bigger role and where it's usually a bit smaller scale and where there's less of that economical impact and more of a connoisseur society rather than a broader public that is required in the gem deposits. So let's head to Africa. To highlight everything that I just discussed about these dynamics of gem deposits, we'll focus really on rubies from East Africa. We could actually call it rubies from Africa because nearly all rubies in Africa are focused in Eastern Africa, limited to a handful of countries. So those are the ones that we'll discuss. When we go to Africa, I just want to highlight this quote. Has nothing to do with gemstones, but I saw it on the back of a safari truck when I was in Tanzania, and it hit home. And it basically said, the only man I envy is the man who has not yet been to Africa, for he has so much to look forward to. And I think that's really true. The photo that we see in the background is actually a photo that I've taken from the highway in Africa and just highlights how magical it is. And that is the highway from Arusha to the border with Kenya. And along that highway is the first deposit that I wanted to discuss. So long before that highway was there, Mount Longido, rubies were already discovered. So that discovery took place in the early 20th century. There's some comments in historical documents about a skirmish called the Battle of Merkerstein between British colonial troops and German troops near the foot of Mount Longido during the First World War. First World War, when parts of Tanzania were under German control. So part of that World War was also fought in East Africa at the foot of Mount Longido. And it is said that one of the soldiers there, some people say it's a German soldier, some people say it's a British soldier, whether it's British or British colonial troops. Honestly, I like the romantic story that it was one of those troops from the British colonies who had experience with gemstones, who found something that he knew from his homeland near the foothills of Mount Longido. But of course, that's all romance. But it is a fact that after the First World War, this deposit was already being developed. Large-scale mining started to happening there. It was not always continuous. People invested, then the deposit was lost for a few years. New people rediscovered it. New investment took place. Of course, like with Tanzania gaining its independence, brought some extra struggles, foreign investors coming in. But that original tunnel is still active, and this is the entrance to that tunnel. So the Longido ruby deposit in Tanzania is a primary deposit, which means people are mining it from hard rock underground. And this is hard rock. This is really tough mining, requires jackhammers, very heavy equipment. And I think the material that comes out of the ground, we're all familiar with it, ruby in zoisite. So ruby and zoisite, you see really big ruby crystals. Sometimes this is referred to as anyolite. Anyolite coming from the local Maasai, because this is Maasai land. The Maasai word for green is anyo, because it's hosted in these green rocks that you get these magnificent bright red hexagons. So this is probably the first commercial ruby source in East Africa. Fun fact that not a lot of people are aware of, this material is extremely fluorescent. So next time you see some of this material, just wave a UV torch over it and you'll be amazed with the reaction. Because I hadn't seen that until I had my UV torch in my pocket. I decided like, yeah, let's give this a go while I was at the mine. And I was amazed with the reaction. Now, I think when you see this kind of material, you all intuitively feel this is probably not the most gemmy, not the most desirable gemstone material. And you're quite right with that. This is not what we typically see as gem material, as faceted gems. However, this is exquisite material for beautiful carving. The Dreher family made some exquisite carvings out of it, combining that beautiful red color with that green zoisite matrix. But there's other exceptional pieces. Like one of my favorite is this complete tea set made out of ruby and zoisite. And there's many other magnificent carvings going on to them. But other than carvings, the crystal formation of it, those beautiful hexagons by themselves are already marvelous. So that's Longido, Tanzania. Probably the first discovered ruby deposit in East Africa. It's still working, it's still active. But of course, over the years, it got competition from other deposits. And then the next one that showed up on the radar is probably going to be Mangari in Kenya. So discovered in 1973 in the Tsavo West National Park. So actually very close to Longido. They're all on that border between Tanzania and Kenya, all related to the same geological same geological orogeny. This is also a primary deposit, but very complex geology, contact between a gneiss and a serpentinite, lots of fracturing, lots of structural deformation going on. There's still debate on exactly how they formed, how important is the role of water, how important is silicon mobility in there. So very interesting deposit, but very challenging. Now this deposit is, while it is a primary deposit, just like Longido, This deposit is extremely weathered. The host rock has been described as rotten. It just crumbles when you pick it up in your hand, and the rubies do not crumble. So it's actually relatively easy to mine. Of course, when you go a little bit deeper, it's not as weathered and it becomes tougher, but overall much easier to mine than Longido. Remember, this is one of those factors, like if it's easier to mine one thing, that has an advantage already. Now, these deposits have a very beautiful history. Like this is an example of one of the mines there, actually called the John Saul mine in Kenya. Now, John Saul might ring a bell. John Saul is this gentleman on the left here, who is actually the discoverer together with his partner of this mine. But it's quite an, let's say, tragic story of this mine development, because at that time he was forced to give up part of the mine, so have a local partner. When local dignitaries found out, they all requested to be partners as well. And at a certain point, he had 150% of his mine owned by local officials. So that's not, that turned into a rather ugly situation. He was forced to abandon the mine, give it up. Nevertheless, the mine still produced, is still called the John Saul mine. And this is an example of that material. You see very nice, sweet color, but the clarity often is not optimal for faceting. There are some faceted materials out there, but even in what we call cabochon grade or bead grade, they're often treated to improve the clarity. Now, the color is desirable as is. In fact, John Saul is still used as a trade name for fine pinkish red cabochons, especially in the trade center in Jaipur. You sometimes hear that term still being used. Like this is John Saul color. Like people say, this is pigeon blood ruby, or this is royal blue sapphire. People still use that term, John Saul color, for these pinkish red cabochons. Now, of course, here we see some really fine examples of some of these rubies, especially that necklace on the red. But you see not a single one of these gems is faceted, but you obviously see this quality surpasses what we call carving grade, but moves into beads cabochon of an exceptional homogeneous color. So Mangari, Kenya is like the second deposit that came on the radar in East Africa. Now, the third one I want to discuss is Morogoro, Tanzania. Actually, a rather complex but very interesting history. And since we're a bit in more recent times, we have more information available about it. We have more people having written down accounts on it from different sources. So here we're in remote mountainous areas in central Tanzania in the Morogoro province. Discoveries were coming in the 1980s, 1990s. And actually shows a lot of geological similarities with Asian rubies. Asian rubies, I'm going to say Burmese rubies. These are also marble related. And this also came at a time when the Thai trade, Thailand being a main center of production and still probably in terms of volume and value, the largest manufacturer of ruby and sapphire. A lot of the traders from Thailand were looking for alternative sources of ruby, and they discovered East Africa. So a lot of investment going on there, a lot of Thai partners working in these mines in Morogoro. Not always successful. Some of them were successful for a while, but most of these deposits in Morogoro were abandoned in favor of other deposits, mainly with the discovery of the Tunduru gem fields in southern Tanzania, which is not really a ruby deposit, but basically has everything else. Much easier to mine, easier to access. So a lot of miners, and especially a lot of Asian buyers, moved there, and that's what caused people to abandon these ruby deposits in Morogoro, Tanzania. Nevertheless, there's still mining going on. There's still people looking for rubies there. And here we've got, on the left, we've got a recent image of some miners showing some rubies there. And you even see like that white carbonate matrix that is very reminiscent of what we see in Burmese rubies, Vietnamese rubies, Tajik Afghan rubies, materials that those Thai traders were very familiar with. On the right, we see a bit more of an older image, but a very nice ruby, star ruby from Morogoro, 4 carats. That's I mean, that's quite the ruby already, of really fine color. That comes from these deposits. Now, you probably noticed that I said deposits, multiple deposits, and that is that Morogoro is actually very confusing terminology. What we see here on the left, this entire province is the Morogoro province. And the Morogoro city is up here in the northern part. And just south of Morogoro city, in Morogoro province, you have the Uluguru Mountains. And the Uluguru Mountains host some ruby deposits, as well as some very interesting garnet deposits, but we'll focus on the rubies here. So you see there's people mining rubies there. One of the most beautiful areas I've ever visited, the Uluguru Mountains in Tanzania. So this is one part of those Morogoro deposits. Now we've got the same province still in the Morogoro province, but further to the south, there's another small mountain range there. And there's rubies found there as well, especially along the southern edge. A place called Lukande. But you can see like the quality of this material is a bit more towards that cabochon grade. There's not that many faceted stones being found there, but you see really big crystals. I mean, this big one here in the back, that's bigger than the size of my fist. So really nice crystals, but not as transparent. You can see different shades of red and pink, and like to very light pink to very saturated red. And this is near a place called Mahenge, the main town in that mountain range is called Mahenge. And of course, Mahenge will probably ring a lot of bells with many people. Mahenge is also the home of the Ipanko Valley. And the Ipanko Valley is the home of those magnificent Mahenge spinels that have really made big waves in the trade, in the gem trade, since I'm going to say 2007. Of course, spinel had been known there for a while, but it is in 2007 that huge crystals, I mean, I'm talking a 52 kilogram crystal of spinel was found, of which some incredible gems were cut. And of course, there's still a lot of spinel mining going on. But that same area is very rich in ruby, a lot of garnet varieties, so very rich gem area, Mahenge, but produces ruby. So remember, if you talk about Morogoro rubies, there's actually two very distinct places where the rubies have a distinct appearance in that Morogoro province. All right. Let's move on to the next one. So we've got Madagascar as the next one. I think Madagascar, you guys all being in the mineralogical community, holds no secrets for you. Madagascar is one of the most desirable locations for a lot of pegmatite-related gems. And in fact, it has been so for more than a century because of one of the most famous French naturalists and authors from those days, Alfred Lacroix. He wrote a book about Madagascar that he just titled Un voyage au pays des barils, which literally means travels to the land of the beryl. So Beryl Island is a term that was used for this island for a long time. Of course, nowadays we know Madagascar mostly for sapphires, especially in gemological circles. I know this might be different in the mineralogical community, where there's a lot of focus on these magnificent tourmaline specimens coming from Madagascar, but also a lot of rare collector gems. But for the gemological community, Madagascar really came on the radar in the mid-90s with discoveries of the gem fields, mainly in Ilakaka, in southern Madagascar, that produced a wide variety of sapphires in all kinds of colors, lots of fancy stones, incredible yellows, pinks, greens, purples, but also a lot of other gem varieties like chrysoberyls, garnets, quartzes. But still, sapphire is the main driver there. Now, when you say sapphire, you think about its brother ruby, because they're the same mineral, just in different colors. However, the amount of ruby found in Ilakaka is negligible. But people were looking for sapphires in all other places, and sapphires have been found in other places in the south, but also in the northeast. And in the northeast, there's rubies found as well. So over the last 2 decades, we've seen several ruby rushes in the jungles of northeastern Madagascar. So this is a mountain range that's still very heavily forested. A lot of it is protected area because most of Madagascar has been stripped clean of its forests to turn into farmlands or is natural grassland. Towards the south, it's more deserty, like Ilakaka is really in the desert. But towards the northeast, it's wetter. You're higher up in the mountains. So it's really in the jungle. And we distinguish 4 main rushes on rubies there, with Vatomandri being the first one, probably not the most important one. But then Andilamena in 2005 was a really big one. Huge crowds. I'll show some images later. Then we have Didi in 2012, which was also a very interesting discovery, because in Didi, you found rubies and sapphires together. So some magnificent sapphires were found there, magnificent rubies, they were found together. That was in 2012. And then in 2015, we saw a ruby rush in Zahamena. These are all in the same area, all in the same geological environments, all in the same natural environments. And these are all rushes. Like they mostly lasted for 6 months, maybe up to a year. Maybe people came back the next year, but not much longer than that. And after that, their peak went down. But those stones are still circulating in the trade. Now, this same area also has seen several sapphire rushes. I think in 2017, there was a very big sapphire rush in an area called Bementi near the town of Ambatundrazak. Those of you that are more involved in the gemological community have certainly heard about this, with exquisite sapphires being found that were initially confused with sapphires from Kashmir. So we're all talking about that same general area up there in the mountains, the jungle mountains of northeastern Madagascar. Now, these are some images of what these rushes look like. So you see, this is really in the jungle, mountain streams, and people working there for a couple of months. Why do I say months? Because you're very limited by the seasons. Once rainy season hits, these places are not really good to live in, to work in. These rivers turn into raging torrents. Plus, a lot of people have to return to their home villages to start mining there, because people from all over Madagascar swarm to these locations to try and make some additional income. But at one point, they have to return home, either because the amount of stones that is found is not sufficient anymore and there's a loss of motivation, or because people are forced home to start growing their crops, start working their fields again. But you see very chaotic scenes. These may look like they're very devastating for the environment, but in fact, if you go back there after 2 years, the jungle has reclaimed all of it. So while it has a very high impact, it's very localized, it's very limited in time, and those jungles are often very resilient and often reclaim a lot of these areas in a matter of years. Here's an image of the jungle village in Andilamena that popped up during the ruby rush. So in this river that runs straight through this makeshift village, like 2 years before, there wasn't a single house here. This was just a river running through the jungle. In this river, people found rubies, and people are mining everywhere along that river, building small wooden cabins. But while you intuitively get the feeling like, yeah, this has destroyed a lot of jungle, because you see they cleared this entire patch. I mean, this entire patch is maybe 4 or 5 football fields. And if you see around it, that jungle is still completely intact and gets reclaimed very quickly. Because people, like a lot of this is built in natural materials. This is all wood. There is some plastic tarp, but that's valuable resource. So people take that with them when they move. So a lot of this is, while it does have a very high impact very locally, but also very limited in time, this usually recovers rather quickly and much quicker than people expect. Now, this is what these people were after. Magnificent ruby. I love it that it has these very cute trigons on it. But amazing color, good sizes, bulky, clean. This is one from Didi, but similar materials have been found in Andilamena, have been found in Zahamena. So this is what people were looking after. This is what drives these rushes. So all of a sudden, that's why I'm based in Bangkok, because most of this material comes to Thailand, comes to Bangkok. You see all of a sudden for 6 months, you see tons of this material coming in and then it stops. But of course, by the time this reaches manufacturers, this reaches wholesalers in consuming countries, this reaches distributors, this reaches the end client, these waves of production have completely smoothed out. So right now, if you go to, for example, Tucson, it is relatively easy to find Madagascar rubies. Although the amount of fine Madagascar rubies that has come out of the ground since 2015 is actually rather low. But these stones are still in the trade, they're still going around, they're circling around, and people are still actively trading this. People are holding on to the rough. There's just not too much of it coming out of the ground until the next rush happens, until the next valley is found that is full of rubies and 10,000s of people swarm there, extract the rubies, deliver it into the trade, and then return to their former business. Okay, so a lot of the material we find in those northeastern Madagascar deposits actually looks like this. So we've got this reddish corundum type of material. And while this doesn't look attractive as is, this benefits a lot from treatment. So this is one thing that people keep mining this material because it can get treated, be improved in that way. And because they keep mining, they have an increased chance of stumbling onto the next big discovery of gem-grade material. So this is the point. Like, if you don't have a market for all that low-grade material, if you cannot move that into the market, there's no incentive, there's no chance of finding that really fine stone. If you don't find a market for that 50 kilograms of low-quality gravel, you're not going to be able to find that 5-carat magnificent stone. That's just the way it is. So the way that this material is treated is by glass filling. So a lot of people think glass filling is the worst thing that you could ever do to a gemstone, but this actually creates a market for this kind of material. Keeps an incentive for miners to keep mining. They make some income with it, and people are manufacturing this. There is a market for it. So you can turn this exact lot on the left into this brighter material on the right. You see color is a bit improved, especially transparency is improved. And in the last years, glass filling got a terrible reputation. But some of the glass-filled materials are actually looking really fine. Like here, we've got different qualities of glass filling. And I think most of the material that we see in the market nowadays is the one on the left, but the one on the right is also glass-filled. Thank God for us, it's very easy to identify because this does obviously make a difference in pricing and value. It's pretty easy to identify, but not all glass-filled stones look terrible. To make that point on pricing, this is a picture I took from a tray somewhere in Tucson 2 years ago. Oh my God, time flies when there's a pandemic around. So I think here you've got an idea of what this material looks like. I think you've all seen this when you walk past gem dealers, that you see these cabochons of silvery star rubies. And these are actually ridiculously cheap, like $2 a carat. Honestly, I think here in Thailand, we see them for 10 baht a carat. So I think about $1 a gram, you could find these here in Thailand. So that's Madagascar. So let's jump back across the Madagascar Strait. We'll go back to mainland East Africa to a place called Winza. Now, Winza in central Tanzania is a place where a ruby rush took place in 2007. This was a very interesting deposit where we have mainly a primary deposit, so where the rubies are mined in hard rock, but a very closely associated secondary deposit in a river. So where people are able to mine rubies that were released over time during erosion from the river, from the hard rock, deposited into the river. So it makes it very easy to mine. Now, these Winza sapphires and rubies have incredible color. They're clean in large sizes. They're everything a dream gem could be, with the exception that if it's not that big, great, clean, amazing colored material, it's basically useless. Because it doesn't react to treatment, you cannot really improve it, which means that this is a deposit that has to live from its 1%ers. And that is not really sustainable. So this ruby rush lasted for, I'm going to say, about a year. People still consider Winza rubies some of the finest rubies ever found, but they were only really found during that 1 year window. People are still mining there. It's still continuing, but it's not the important deposit that it was in 2007, 2008. And that is mainly because there is not a big market for these smaller, lower grade materials because they cannot be improved. And there are other deposits where that is the case, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So this is an image of Winza, Tanzania, where we've got people mining in the river. But actually very interesting, this is a satellite image, the big red ruby here. That's where the primary deposit is. So that's where people dig in tunnels, hard rock deposits. And there were two washing sites, two mining sites in the river where people mined. But they're only 1 kilometer apart and less than 1 kilometer from the hard rock deposit. So my inner geologist just screams like, yeah, just go down river and I'm pretty sure it's going to be chock full of rubies there. But for one reason or another, nobody ever did that. So there's probably huge potential still in Winza, but because you cannot live off 99% of the gems that you find because there's no market for them, people have no incentive to do that. Here's a range of stones that we found in Winza. So apart from really fine rubies, we find other color varieties as well. And then some of my favorite gem, ruby, sapphires are the stones that have ruby and sapphire in them. So this is probably one of the deposits where you see some of the finest bicolor corundum combining blue and red in the same stone. Really exceptional, really highly desired in some connoisseurs markets. I know Australia has a big demand for it, I think, because there's a lot of Australian sapphires that are bicolor, so they are more readily accepting of those materials. But blue-red combination is extraordinarily rare. That brings us to the next deposit, Montepuez, Mozambique. Now, Montepuez in Mozambique, I think if you're involved a little bit in gem trading or in the gem community, you know that Mozambique is a big thing in the ruby world right now. These deposits were discovered in 2008 with initially two smaller deposits in the Niassa Reserve, which is this right here. Impenetrable jungle, extremely remote, infested with malaria. Beautiful area, but not a place you want to go live full-time and work start a ruby mine. Plus, you cannot really develop a ruby mine there because this is protected area. So there's some artisanal illegal mining that took place there. While it wasn't really a great success, it focused people, it made local people aware of there is this thing called ruby and you can make some money with it. So let's keep an eye open for it. So in 2009, rubies were found near a place called Montepuez, here towards the south. Now, while Niassa is remote, inaccessible, difficult to work in a protected reserve, so no potential for large-scale mining, Montepuez is literally on the highway. The deposit is literally on the highway. It's not in a protected area, so there is potential for official mining, for mining licenses. So this shows a lot more promise than those two deposits in Niassa. So April 2009, these rubies were found here. This is the road along which the rubies were found. Initially, there were two mine sites, one called Namahaka, where lower grade material was found, and then a place called Namahumbir, named after the village of Namahumbir, although it's actually a few kilometers away from it, where more facet grade material was found. So that's April 2009. By summer 2009, so July, August, the first material comes to Thailand. Like I mentioned Thailand before, Bangkok is the ruby trading capital, and Chanthaburi, small, super fun city towards the east, is the ruby treatment capital. A lot of ruby and sapphire treatments that have been developed over the last decades were developed in that little town towards the east. It's also a capital where, it's also a place where a lot of sapphire mining took place. It's close to the Thai ruby mines. So obviously there's a lot of local expertise on gem mining, gem trading. So that's why most of this material comes to Thailand. Here we see an incredible example of a fine colored ruby, but of course, transparency is lacking, so this would never be faceted. So this is an example of what you would find in Namahaka. But then Namahumbir is material like this. So smaller stones though, but intensely colored, relatively strong fluorescence, flat crystals. Sizes can be huge, but only the small sizes are going to be clean like this. This was called Bodang, called the red mine by the Thai traders. And this is a type that we've called maninganite because the deposit that they mined this initially was called maninganite, which is local slang for good quality. So this maninganite type looks like this: intensely colored, strong fluorescent, clean in small sizes, and those flat crystals. Very intimately related with a primary deposit. That's what explains the angular nature. So initially, this was all mined by artisanal miners and huge groups of artisanal miners. So 2009, 2010. So by 2010, Montepuez is probably the most important source for rubies in the Thai trade. By 2011, Mozambican ruby is probably the most dominant ruby globally. Now, all this and then I'm talking in wholesale levels if you go to trade shows and things like that, not, of course, in your average jewelry store. But all this ruby was mined by artisanal miners and left Mozambique undocumented. Now, of course, with such a huge success, more deposits were found in that general area. So here we've got Montepuez on the left. We've got the highway running through. And you see the original maninganite deposit, the Namahaka deposit. But the whole ruby covering area is like 70 by 40 kilometers wide, where you find rubies basically all over the place. Now, in 2012, a different type of ruby was found in the exact same area. It's larger, it's bulky, so it doesn't have that flat appearance, which means that you can cut bigger stones from it. They're clean. They have a bit of a darker color, what people call a closed color, so a little bit darker tone, and a lower fluorescence. The Thai people call this bosom, the orange mine, because the color, because it's a bit darker, tends to be a bit more orangey. And this is what we sometimes refer to as Muglotto type. So Muglotto is the name of the original location where this was found, and most of these stones were initially mined. But you see here, the 40-carat rhino ruby that was mined and sold by Gemfields, which was a flawless, incredible ruby. I'd love to know where that one went and what it turned out to be, but I'm afraid that it's buried in someone's safe very, very deeply. So if you combine these two things, you've got two types, which means that you've got a huge variety of color, all the way from pink to really dark red, with varieties in the purple and the orange colors as well. You've got stones from loop clean to completely opaque. You've got stones from sub 1 millimeter that you can use to cut melee to plus 100 carat that obviously need to be treated or opaque, but can be used for carving art objects. But you have plus 10 carat clean, flawless stones. You've got untreated, heated, flux healed, glass filled, variety of treatments, which means that there's a huge variety of Mozambican rubies that can cater to every segment of the market, explaining why this deposit is so successful. So this Mozambican ruby deposit probably contributed to the decrease of a lot of other deposits. The Kenyan ruby deposit cannot compete with what Mozambique is putting out, because Mozambique has what Kenya has, but better. Mozambique has what Morogoro has, but better. Mozambique has what Madagascar has, but better. Mozambique has what Winza has, but more and better. So, of course, this is the ruby deposit that is best adapted to current situation. Of course, that changes very rapidly. With this huge influx of artisanal miners, total lack of a legislation control, virtual power vacuum, sort of lawlessness, that created situations where some people were able to take advantage. Large mining companies coming in, creating friction with the local communities. So that all contributed to some of the decrease of Mozambique. It actually resulted into people being, a lot of artisanal miners being turning unlicensed, turned into criminals. While it used to be a slap on the wrist if you were caught mining artisanally without a license, now it means serious jail time. So this repression of artisanal miners, plus an expulsion of the buyers of the audience for those small-scale miners. So the people that were buying there, the Sri Lankan, Thai buyers, they were all expelled. They were forced to look at other sources of rubies. But when that happened, that was about in 2016 when there was a big push to drive them out. Those people were forced to look at other sources of rubies, at other sources of gemstone, because they are supplying their factories, their businesses in Thailand, Sri Lanka, which form the foundation of most of the ruby and sapphire trade. They need to keep supplying them with material to keep it running. So thank God for them. About the time that they were pushed out of Mozambique and looking for an alternative, a miraculous discovery was made in Longido, Tanzania. So in 2016, 2017, high quality material was found as one of the levels. With the levels, I mean, there's this big tunnel and there's different levels there. I believe there's 17. And at 2 of those levels, people found pockets of ruby crystals that were actually of slightly higher quality. They would be facet in quality in really small sizes though, but they have an incredible color with that strong fluorescence, even in those smaller sizes, because that's usually a challenge in those small sizes. Because if you reduce the size, your color intensity goes down. So even if you have a very fine, beautiful red big stone, if you cut it down to melee sizes, 1-2 millimeter, it becomes pink. While the stones at Longido are such intense color that even in 1 millimeter sizes, they hold their color and they're a fantastic red. Plus, they don't require treatment in most cases because they have that good clarity in smaller sizes. They have that amazing color already. So that really revitalized that whole area. I visited it right before those discoveries, and then I went back 2 years ago. And the change in the town of Mundarara, where most of the mines are, where the original mine was hosted, where the Maasai community is based, that has completely transformed. New houses being built, a thriving market has developed. There's electricity in there, like they put the power line all the way there. There's new water wells being dug. But most important was the amount of cattle that you saw around. Maasai don't invest in anything else. The amount of cattle that you have reflects your wealth. And while you did see some sheep, some goats, the occasional cow, on my first visit in 2016, when I visited in 2019, there were huge herds of cows owned by the same people that only had a few cows and a few goats before. So this really brought a lot of wealth to this community. In fact, so much that they've started digging new shafts. Like originally there was only the one single shaft of the Mundarara mine. There's new shafts being dug. There's a thriving market where you see people trading really small rough, breaking up those bigger crystals to retrieve those smaller pieces because there's an active demand for it from Thai, from Chinese buyers. That you can see, like even in those small sizes, very nice, deep, dark color with incredible fluorescence. And that results in stones like this. Beautiful, well-cut, deep red, small sized, but very highly desired in the trade. Like imagine what kind of jewelry you can make with this. That would blow everyone's mind. So I think with this image, that brings us full circle from Longido back to Longido. I think we can wrap it up. So just to summarize, like I want to highlight for everyone that gem mining areas can change rapidly. That is very dynamic. Depends on local conditions, could be the politics, could be natural. Also the market conditions, the quality, the volume, reaction to treatment. And then how that deposit adapts to that, which results in survival of the fittest, with Mozambique eclipsing all the other ones because it was just more able to adapt, more suited to adapt to the current market demands. But you see that in East Africa, you've got ruby mining areas all over the place, but they haven't all been dominant. At one point, they've switched positions where we went from Longido to Mangari in the 70s, Morogoro in the 80s, then Madagascar in the early 2000s. We briefly had that Winza interception in 2007, but that very quickly shifted back to Montepuez in 2009. And then it actually circled back to Longido. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that this is a clear start-stop. All these deposits are still producing. Like if you go there, you still find rubies. These aren't exhausted, but their importance in the gem market has been shifting and is very clearly dynamic and changed very rapidly. So I hope you guys all enjoyed this. A little bit of alternative presentation, I guess, for you guys in the mineralogical circles, that you learned something, that you appreciated the gemstones more, that you appreciated the gem community more, get some more insight in that, maybe are a little bit more interested in it, try to take some steps in that direction, because it's very exciting. It has a lot of overlap with the mineralogical world. And I learn a lot every time I talk to people from the gemological community. But at the same time, there are so much different aspects, so much different challenges that I thoroughly enjoy. So I thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. I think we've got some time for a Q&A, so we'll see if we can get that going.